So it turns out getting the engine in the hole was the easy bit. Getting it lined up and getting some drive to the wheels became a bit of a challenge. I was immediately very concerned with the length of drive shaft on the passenger side. The Lancia Beta drive shaft's already really short and basically the minimum I reckon you could get away with. When we got the car, it came with a V6 fitting kit which included a couple of adapter spacer plates to adapt the Alpha gearbox output flange to the Lancia Beta drive shaft, and they were 20mm thick, which meant that the whole engine and gearbox assembly had to be pushed over the driver's side almost to the point where the cams were hitting the McPherson strut, and also the weight was quite biased to the driver's side, so not ideal. I started getting very concerned about maybe I should forget about fitting the engine and start looking at the hub and suspension arrangement. But I've decided that if I line up the Alpha gearbox flange to the same lateral location as the original Lancia Beta gearbox flange, then I know that I can, at worst case scenario, I can run a Lancia shaft with an Alpha end adapter to it and get some new shafts made up. I've since worked out that with the offset of the wheels I'm going to run, I can push the whole suspension out by 40mm on each side to give us another 40mm of travel to play with. But that's a project for another day. So at the moment I've got the Alpha flange lined up with where the Lancia flange was. That means the engine's almost very close to centralised weight-wise, and everything appears to clear. So I'll show you the elaborate jig setup to locate the engine. So I've got a bit of RHS clamped to the RHS chassis rail there, and that's bolted to the Alpha to Lancia adapter ring, and that ring is 20mm thick and was exactly the right dimension to give me the spacing back to the output shaft of the gearbox. So that provides the sort of lateral location to the engine. It also helps sort of square everything up, but there's quite a bit of free play in the drive and the output shaft of the gearbox, so couldn't rely on that for everything. Underneath that output shaft I've got a 10mm spacer and a shim washer there, or a shim plate, and that's setting the height of the chassis rail for the output flange on the passenger side. The driver's side was a little bit more complicated. I'm missing that lay shaft, or whatever you call it. I have these silly front wheel drives, don't know what everything's called, but the shaft that goes from the diff, was I saying gearbox before? Anyway, if I was saying gearbox before, I meant output shaft of the diff. The output shaft of the diff on the driver's side to that bearing carrier. I'm missing that shaft. I've got two of them, both from Alphas, and they're both the wrong spline, so I need to track that down. Anyway, that meant I had to make up something else to align the other side of the car. I happen to have a massive bit of bar stock that was very close to the right size, so I turned one end down to the OD of the bearing, and that mounts into the bearing carrier with a big bolt out of a spring compressor kit pulling it all together, and then turn down the other end to a suitable size. I've got that sitting on a V-block and a couple more shims to get it to the same centre height as the other side. So that's how I've set the height across the car. So with all that set up, I've got my favourite little mini square and a suitable bit of shim off the angle line reference off the back, and lined up the side of the drive shaft on one side. If you can see that, like that. And on the driver's side, I've got a couple of blocks to take up the difference in flange diameters across the car, and just did the same thing. lined up the engine that way. And once I was happy with that, another big clamp to clamp it all into place. I'm quickly running out of C-clamps. So then I just went around and did a few spot checks, some rules and squares, just to make sure I hadn't buggered up the maths somehow, which I usually do. First thing I tried to check was using these studs in some nice threaded holes in the cam cover, and then run a straight edge across there and measure it to the back of the chassis. Ended up with a difference of 3 or 4 mil. Chased that for 20 minutes before I realised that the cam cover isn't square to the head, so threw that idea in the bin. But it did mean I did go over everything and triple check all my measurements, and all looked good. As you can see, there's not a huge amount of clearance between the cam belt cover and the back chassis rail. I think there's enough there. I don't want to push the engine any further forward, because that just means the drive shafts are going to be working at even more of an angle than they need to. So confident that the engine's square to the chassis, and flat in this direction. The sort of the pitch or the rock of the engine, I've set using the bottom of the engine mount as a flat, and leveled that with this rail here. I think that's about as close as I'm going to be able to get it. Pretty happy where it's at. I've got a block of wood on that side supporting it. I've still got the engine crane here because I don't want to load everything up, but it's very solid, so I can start building some engine mounts. So actually do some fabrication. So engine mounts, where do we start? The V6 engine mounts that are on the road car aren't really an option. They're expensive and they provide too much movement, so they're out. The V6 fitting kit came with these. I'm not really prepared to call them engine mounts. They look like they're more suitable for reducing the vibration of a microwave oven or something, but they would make installation very, very easy. I think the danger of these, apart from just a single stud, which is probably okay, is that these plates are almost definitely going to delaminate off the rubber block at some point. This is the engine mount off the 2 litre 105 off the other rally car. This would actually bolt straight up to each side of the V6, the same spacing, but again, we've had at least one of these engine mounts completely fail where the plate just delaminated off the rubber and almost cost us a rally, so we won't be using those either. This is a rear trailing arm rubber bush from the 105. That was an option, but that could work. But what I've decided to go for is some of these, which are leaf spring bushes off a Holden Rodeo, I think. So they're cheap. They're still completely rubber isolated. If the rubber does fail, it fails safely as it's completely captive once you've got a clevis on one side and a tube on that side. So if the rubber is to fail, the engine's just going to knock around. It's not going to leap out of the car. So let's try fitting these up. So we managed to find some very heavy wall pipe, some nominal bore 40 by shed 80, which is I think 48 by 39 or something, which gives me enough meat to bore out a suitable fit for our bushing. There's a big horrible weld bead in there. Hopefully that doesn't chip my carbide insert, but we'll see how we go. A bit of time on the lathe. Got a nice housing for our rubber bush, which we'll press in there like that, hopefully. It's a little bit wider, a little bit thicker wall than it probably needs to be, but hopefully that'll reduce the distortion when I'm welding to it. Don't want to go welding around the rubber bush, so I've turned up a couple of little LE end caps to emulate the bush. It's got a bolt hole. I'm going to run an M10 bolt, so I'll need to turn up a little LE bush later to suit this, and that is the same height now as the inner diameter of the bush. So now connected to the engine. This came with the kit. I think it was supposed to suit this engine mount like that. This is actually the gearbox mount. The gearbox sits quite a way out over the chassis rail. The chassis rail's here, hence the need for this bend. It fits in there quite well. I might add an extra brace up to one of the gearbox bolts back in this direction. But I think the main idea is I'll trim that off and weld that into there like that. Strangely, this isn't square to the engine, it sort of kicks off a little bit. I want this to be square to the chassis rail, so with the height gauge I've just marked a line all the way around there, square to this flange, which should bring everything back in line when I fish mouth this to weld this. So time for some grinder action. Managed to remove the end and recover most of the tube, so now I need to put a small fish mouth in here to meet up with our new bushing mount. So I'm just going to sort of move it up to where I want it and just sort of mark it by eye. So I'll grind that out and just keep moving up until I'm happy with the fit. First engine mount complete. I'll admit it did get slightly overcomplicated, but yeah, the original factory gearbox pickup point was a fair way away from the chassis rail, so I wanted to brace it a bit more. Hopefully all this means that now making the chassis mount part of the engine mount should be quite simple. So we'll bolt it in the car and have a look what we're up for. So bolted in the car, you can see we're pretty close to that chassis rail, so now I've got some RHS and hopefully it's the right size to make a nice chassis mount to connect to our tubular engine mount. Cardboard template of the chassis mount. As you can see, I always get my cardboard templates right first time. So the idea is this is a cutout for the chassis rail. This will come up off on an angle. The bolt for the pivot for the engine mount goes through here. So I think I'll cut off a section about this long and then cut this section out on the bandsaw. And then go and take the car and see if we're on the right track. That cutout's put us in roughly the right spot, so I think we can move on. I'm going to mark out the outer diameter of the engine mount on the RHS now. Engine mount 1 complete. Let's put it in the car. All fits in very nicely. I'll mark it up and start taking some paint off that bottom chassis rail so I can weld it in. But before I do that, I think I'll move on to engine mount number 2. So engine mount 2 is back here. Not a great place to get to, but as you can see, the studs for the engine mount are right above the chassis rail, so this should be a little bit easier to make. Finished? No, that's the factory engine mount. I thought about maybe using that and bolting a little plate on down here, but I think it's just going to be much neater to remake the entire thing. It should be just a simple case of making a plate and then having a bit of a leg coming off that plate, but I'm sure I can find a way to overcomplicate the situation. Right, been going over it for a while, and I think I've come up with a good way of overcomplicating the situation. I've got a bit of 1.5mm steel. Just used the original engine mount to mark out the holes. They're a weird spacing, so it's hard to measure, so I just use it as a template to mark it out. I'll drill the holes, and I've got these little, turned up these little ferrules. I will weld them on there, that way around, and then this will be the leg coming off the plate, and then I'll make up two sides and box this whole section in, so it's a sort of three-dimensional box section bracket. It'll be awesome! Yep, managed to totally overcomplicate it. Kind of weld it up. So jump forward in time, and we have a complete V6 quad cam engine mounting kit. I think you saw me finish off the gearbox mount already. This is the front engine mount. And this is the rear engine mount. The rear engine mount leg also encompasses the bearing for the bearing holder for the lay shaft that connects to the outer drive shaft. So I couldn't remake that whole leg, so I just made this, I guess you call it a little foot that that the leg can bolt to. I could have just made this out of a solid block and then drilled and tapped a hole there for the bolt to go through, but I wanted to use a nylock, so I made like this little captive nut arrangement. So machined out a little, this is a hollow section, machined out a window, and I've got some walls in there, and we can just slide a nylock in and bolt her up. That way if the thread gets damaged, I can just replace the nut rather than having to remake the whole part. So spent an hour on my back under the car cleaning off paint off chassis rails. I think it's all ready to bolt back in and fire up the welder. As you can see, access is somewhat limited, so I think what I'll do is go around and get some really good tacks on all the mounts, and then rip the whole engine out so I can get a good go at it. Let's get on to some tacking. Well, that was a bit of work, but I think well worth the effort. Plenty of access now. So a coffee and then fire up the welder. So nearly there. Just got to finish this top section off here and it's done. Loving working on an RHS chassis. Everything's straight. So much easier than working on like a formed body shell. Makes making brackets easy, makes the welding easy. It's awesome. Using 2.4mm filler rod. Only picked this stuff up a little while ago. I used to always use 1.6, and then I had a job to do where I had to fill some pretty big gaps, so I picked some of this stuff up. But it's great for even well-fitting parts too. You get a nice big bead, nice strong weld, and you don't have to keep picking up filler rod. Alright, last bit. I've been noticing quite a few impurities in some of the steel though. Yeah, and that's what happens to your TIG tip when you hit one. It just blows all this crud onto your TIG tip. And then I've got to go and grind it again. Okay, so scratch that. They weren't impurities. It was actually my fault. This fillet section in here is pretty small and it was sealed up all the way around. And what was happening was the air was expanding when it was getting hot and blowing the weld out back at me. So I've built a little 1.5mm hole in there to help evacuate some of the hot air and see if that improves the situation. Gearbox mount, front engine mount, rear engine mount. Due to owning mostly Italian cars, I have a deep-seated fear of rust, so I've quickly sprayed all the engine mounts in a beautiful brown etch primer. Anyway, I think it's dry enough now to throw the engine back in and hope it fits. Two. Alright, the moment of truth. Good. Well, that was a hell of a lot of work, but I think it worked pretty well. All the clearances look good, all the mounts look super strong, and I'm happy to move forward to the next item on the infinite list. And I think that might be getting the wheels to turn. A few issues to contend with. Drive shaft lengths, wanting to run the 105 wheels, which are a 108 PCD. So I think some fairly hefty modifications are going to be required, which will probably include a full set of new bottom arms. But first, a celebratory beverage. Yeah. Cheers.